Before cities, before kingdoms, before taxes or borders or any of humanity's other regrettable inventions, there was simply skin, a thin, vulnerable wrapping. And for the vast majority of human existence, every single person walking this planet had basically the same color of it, deep brown, like rich earth after rain, like the bark of an ancient acacia tree, like the color of patience. Then humans did what humans have always done. They started wandering off, across savannas, through river valleys, over mountain passes that led to places no one had ever seen. And as they wandered, something strange began to happen. The sun, which had always been the same indifferent cosmic furnace their ancestors knew, started treating different groups of humans very differently. Not because the sun was cruel or clever, but because geography is a silent architect. And pigmentation, it turns out, is a conversation between sunlight and survival. A conversation that has been happening for over 100,000 years. Tonight, we're going to listen in. Dim the lights. Turn on a fan if you have one. Get comfortable. We're about to unravel why humans became the most beautifully confusing palette of colors on this planet. And along the way, we're going to discover something far stranger than skin deep. But before we begin, I want to know where you are right now. Not your exact address, obviously. That would be unsettling for both of us. Just the country, and what time it is there. Because skin color stories are geography stories, and knowing where you're listening from somehow makes this whole thing feel more real. Drop it in the comments, only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you don't, skip it. No hard feelings. Now, let's go back, way back, before sunscreen, before hats, before air conditioning or air travel, or any of the thousand small ways modern humans have declared war on their environment, and mostly won. Back to a time when the only thing standing between a person and the full, unfiltered fury of the equatorial sun was melanin. And not everyone had enough of it, because at first no one had any reason to lack it. Humanity was born under the African sun. That much is fairly settled. Around 200,000 years ago, the first anatomically modern humans lived in a world where ultraviolet radiation from the sun poured down with all the subtlety of a king collecting overdue taxes. And the human body, being the absurdly inventive machine that it is, developed a solution: melanin. Little dark pigment granules produced by cells called melanocytes, which sound like something from a science fiction novel but are actually just your skin's way of building an umbrella from the inside. The darker your skin, the more melanin you had. The more melanin you had, the better protected you were from ultraviolet rays trying to do what ultraviolet rays love doing: breaking things. Specifically, breaking folate. Folate is one of those vitamins nobody talks about at dinner parties, but without it, human reproduction basically stops working. Folate deficiency leads to neural tube defects in developing embryos, which means that if you're a pregnant human living under intense equatorial sun without enough melanin, your baby's spine might not form correctly. Natural selection noticed. Natural selection notices everything. Over hundreds of thousands of years, the human populations that stayed near the equator became very, very dark-skinned. Not because the sun demanded it, not because it was fashionable, but because the alternative was a quiet, persistent reduction in successful pregnancies. Evolution is not a designer. Evolution is an editor. It doesn't invent solutions from scratch. It just removes the versions that fail to reproduce. And under the African sun, light-skinned versions failed to reproduce often enough that eventually they didn't exist anymore. So for most of human history, the question, why are there different skin colors, would have made no sense. Everyone was brown. Variations existed, sure, but within a relatively narrow band of deep protective pigmentation. The world was, from a skin color perspective, remarkably boring. Then humans got restless. And restlessness, as history repeatedly demonstrates, is the engine of almost everything interesting and almost everything terrible. Around 70,000 years ago, small groups began migrating out of Africa. Not because they had a plan, not because they looked at a map and decided on a destination. Maps didn't exist. The concept of continents didn't exist. They were just following food, or escaping drought, or getting pushed out by neighboring groups who were also following food. Human movement has always been less about wanderlust and more about the very practical problem of everything here is already eaten. These early migrations crept along coastlines and through river valleys. They moved slowly enough that no single generation realized they were migrating at all. A family might move 30 miles north over 2 decades because the hunting was slightly better there. Their grandchildren moved another 30 miles. Their great-grandchildren kept going. After 2,000 years, no one remembered Africa. They only remembered the land in front of them. And the sun had changed. Because as you move north or south from the equator, the sun's angle changes. The same amount of sunlight spreads over a larger area. Ultraviolet radiation drops, in some places, dramatically. Northern Europe, for example, receives about 1/7 the annual UV of equatorial Africa. And that dramatic drop created an equally dramatic problem. The opposite problem. The problem no one had ever needed to solve before. See, melanin is excellent at blocking ultraviolet radiation. That's its job. It does that job so well that it also blocks something humans need. Vitamin D. Vitamin D is not actually a vitamin. It's a hormone. But that's a technical distinction that only matters to biochemists and people trying to win arguments on the internet. For our purposes, what matters is that human skin produces vitamin D when exposed to ultraviolet B rays, and vitamin D is absolutely essential for calcium absorption. Without enough vitamin D, bones become soft, children develop rickets, adults develop osteomalacia, pelvises deform, and deformed pelvises make childbirth, which is already one of the most dangerous things a human body can attempt, considerably more dangerous. So here's the paradox that early migrating humans walked into, completely unaware, because nobody had warned them, and also because nobody existed yet who understood any of this. Dark skin, the very thing that kept your ancestors alive under the African sun, becomes a liability when you move to places with weak sunlight. You're carrying the world's most effective umbrella, only to discover that where you're going, it barely rains. Natural selection, ever the ruthless editor, had to figure this out. And natural selection, being fundamentally mindless, had no idea it was figuring anything out. It just watched what happened. People with lighter skin, in northern latitudes, had an easier time producing enough vitamin D. Their bones stayed stronger, their pelvises stayed wider, their children survived childbirth more often. Over thousands of generations, the populations that migrated farthest from the equator became lighter and lighter, not because anyone decided to change color, but because the ones who didn't change color didn't leave as many descendants. This is the part where people often get confused. They imagine evolution as a ladder, with light skin at the top and dark skin at the bottom, or the reverse, depending on their particular brand of historical ignorance. But evolution doesn't have ladders. Evolution has trade-offs. Dark skin blocks UV. That's good near the equator, where UV is dangerous. That's bad far from the equator, where UV is scarce. Light skin allows UV in. That's good far from the equator, where UV is rare. That's bad near the equator, where UV destroys folate. There is no best skin color. There is only skin color that works where you live. And where you live has never been a choice. It's been a consequence of where your great-great-great-grandparents wandered, which itself was a consequence of where their great-great-great-grandparents wandered, which was a consequence of a fish swimming slightly differently 600 million years ago. We are all just the accumulated results of unbroken chains of small decisions made by people who had no idea what they were deciding. But the story gets stranger. Because if it were just about latitude and UV radiation, skin color would form perfect bands around the planet. Dark at the equator, progressively lighter as you move north and south, like a gradient in a graphic design software that someone forgot to turn off. That's not what happened. Look at the indigenous peoples of the Americas. People living at the equator in South America have skin tones much lighter than equatorial Africans. Why? Because their ancestors migrated from Siberia into the Arctic, across the Bering Land Bridge, and that migration happened relatively recently in evolutionary terms, maybe 15,000 years ago. Not nearly enough time for natural selection to fully adjust skin color to a completely new UV environment. especially when those populations then move south along the Andes, from freezing high-altitude deserts to steamy lowland jungles in a few thousand years. Evolution works on timescales that make human history look like a blink. 15,000 years is nothing, it's a sneeze. But then you look at the Arctic peoples themselves, the Inuit, the Yupik, people living at latitudes where UV radiation is extremely low, where you'd expect very light skin. And yet their skin is considerably darker than Scandinavians living at similar latitudes. Why? Because diet. This is the part of the story that most explanations skip. And it's arguably the most fascinating part, because it reveals that skin color isn't just about sunlight, it's about what you eat. The Inuit traditional diet is extremely high in vitamin D. Fish, seal, whale, these foods are rich in vitamin D even without sunlight exposure. So the selective pressure to develop light skin, to allow more UV in for vitamin D production, was much weaker. They could keep their darker skin with all its protection against UV because they were getting vitamin D from their food anyway. Evolution, ever the pragmatist, said, if it's not broken, don't fix it. Or rather, evolution didn't say anything, but the outcome was the same. Meanwhile, in Northern Europe, early agricultural populations switched from a diet of fish and game to one based on grains. Grains contain almost no vitamin D. Suddenly, the only source of vitamin D was sunlight, and at northern latitudes, with dark skin, that wasn't enough. So those populations lightened, fast, by evolutionary standards, blindingly fast. In maybe 5,000 years, skin color in Northern Europe shifted dramatically, because the alternative was rickets. And rickets, as selective pressures go, is remarkably effective. So skin color is a conversation between latitude, migration history, and dinner. But we're not done, because there's another layer, one that most people never think about. And it has nothing to do with the sun at all. Sexual selection. Humans, as you may have noticed, have opinions about how other humans look. And those opinions, however shallow or arbitrary they seem, have shaped our biology in ways we're only beginning to understand. There is evidence, still debated but increasingly compelling, that preferences for certain skin tones emerged in different populations. Not because lighter or darker skin was objectively healthier in every context, but because humans are vain. And vain preferences, repeated over thousands of generations, can amplify traits even when natural selection alone wouldn't have pushed them that far. If your culture associates lighter skin with status because lighter-skinned people don't work in the fields, then lighter-skinned individuals might have more children. Not because they're healthier, because they're richer. And wealth, historically, has been a fantastic predictor of reproductive success. That's not natural selection, that's social selection, and it's been operating on human populations for at least the last 10,000 years. Probably longer. The same process can work in reverse. Cultures that value darker skin, associating it with outdoor labor and vitality, might prefer darker partners. Preferences shift, fashions change, and all the while, human pigmentation keeps adjusting, like a thermostat being nudged back and forth by someone who can't decide what temperature they want. So skin color is a conversation between latitude, migration history, diet, sexual preference, and fashion. But even that isn't the whole story. Because here's where things become genuinely strange. You might assume, given everything we've discussed, that skin color is one of the most genetically significant differences between human populations, that it represents deep, ancient divergence, that people with different skin colors are, in some meaningful genetic sense, far apart. They are not. The genes that determine skin color are among the most recently evolved and most rapidly changing parts of the human genome. They are, in evolutionary terms, the newest paint on an extremely old house. Two people with dramatically different skin colors can be, genetically, far more similar to each other than two people with the same skin color who happen to come from different populations within the same continent. The genetic difference between a Swedish person and a Nigerian person across their entire genome is about 6% of what's possible between any two humans. The overwhelming majority of human genetic variation exists within populations, not between them. Skin color is a thin veneer, a recent adaptation, a temporary solution to local problems that will change again as populations keep moving, which they will, because humans have never been good at staying put. This is the irony that the narrator of this story has been gently leading toward. For thousands of years, humans have divided themselves by skin color. They've built hierarchies, justified atrocities, created entire philosophical systems to explain why some skin colors were better than others. They've fought wars over it, written laws about it, cried over it, killed over it, and all of this, every last bit of it, was built on a misunderstanding so profound that it's almost funny, if it weren't so tragic. But history, as we've established, rarely rewards sensible decisions. Skin color is weather, it's latitude, it's what your great-grandmother ate, it's how far your ancestors walked before they decided to stop. It's not a soul, it's not a destiny, it's not a measure of worth, it's melanin, little pigment granules produced by cells called melanocytes. That's all. That's everything. And yet the human obsession with skin color is itself a fascinating historical artifact. It tells us less about biology than about psychology, about the strange, anxious way humans build tribes, about how we take any difference, no matter how superficial, and turn it into a wall, about how fear of the other is always, about not understanding why the other is the way they are. Which brings us back to where we started. Before cities, before kingdoms, before taxes, there was skin. And every human had basically the same color of it, deep brown, like rich earth after rain, like the bark of an ancient acacia tree, like the color of patience. Then humans started wandering off. And the rest, as they say, is history. But we're not actually done. Because skin color is only one small chapter in the much larger story of human physical diversity. And once you understand that story, once you really see how evolution works, you start to notice that everything you thought you knew about human variation is slightly wrong, or completely wrong, or so wrong that it's almost impressive. So let's keep wandering. Let's talk about the other ways humans changed as they moved around this planet. And let's start with something that seems simple, but is actually one of the strangest stories in all of human evolution. Faces. Why do people from different parts of the world have different face shapes? Why do some populations have longer noses, others wider cheekbones, others more pronounced brow ridges? These aren't random. And they aren't primarily about sexual selection, despite what you might assume. They're about climate, specifically about the simple, brutal physics of breathing. The air you breathe is not just air. It's temperature, it's humidity, it's dust. And your nose, that peculiar protrusion in the middle of your face, is a miniature air conditioning and filtration system. Its job is to warm cold air before it hits your lungs, to humidify dry air, to trap particles before they cause damage, and different climates require different designs. This was first noticed seriously in the 19th century by a physician named Arthur Thomson, who had the kind of quiet observational genius that rarely gets celebrated. Thomson measured hundreds of skulls from different populations and noticed a pattern. People from cold, dry climates tended to have long, narrow noses. People from hot, humid climates tended to have short, wide noses. Why? Because long noses have more surface area. More surface area means more tissue to warm and humidify air. If you live in the Arctic, breathing 40-degree air directly into your lungs is a bad time. Your lungs know this. Your nose figured out a solution, or rather, natural selection figured it out for your nose. People with longer noses in cold climates had fewer respiratory infections. Their children survived more often. Over thousands of generations, noses got longer. Meanwhile, in hot, humid climates, long noses are unnecessary. The air is already warm, already moist. What you need is to move air efficiently. Short, wide noses create less resistance, less work to breathe. And in a hot environment where every calorie matters, efficiency is survival. But here's where it gets weird. The same principle applies to the entire face. Cold-adapted populations tend to have flatter faces, less projection. Because projecting features get cold faster, they freeze. Frostbite on a prominent nose is not, historically speaking, a great evolutionary strategy. So faces flattened, cheekbones widened to protect the nose, brow ridges developed to shade eyes from snow glare. Every feature, every curve, every angle of the human face is a conversation between genetics and geography. A frozen conversation, a fossilized argument that your face is still having with the place your ancestors lived 10,000 years ago. And that's just faces. We could talk about body proportions, about how populations near the equator evolved longer limbs and narrower torsos because long limbs have more surface area relative to volume, which helps dissipate heat. About how Arctic populations evolved shorter limbs and broader torsos because compact bodies retain heat better. About how the tallest humans on the planet are from the Nile Valley in Africa and the shortest from the forests of Southeast Asia, and how both of those body types make perfect sense if you understand the environmental pressures that shaped them. We could talk about lactose tolerance, about how most of the world's adults cannot digest milk because the gene that produces lactase, the enzyme that breaks down lactose, normally turns off after weaning. But in populations that domesticated cattle, sheep, or goats, a mutation spread that kept lactase active into adulthood, not because it was better, because in times of famine, being able to drink milk without violent digestive distress was enough of an advantage to change the genetics of an entire continent. We could talk about altitude adaptation, about how Tibetans and Andean peoples evolved completely different solutions to the same problem of low oxygen at high altitude. Tibetans developed genes that prevent their blood from thickening. Andeans developed larger lungs and more red blood cells. Two populations. Same challenge. Two radically different biological answers. Evolution, it turns out, is not particularly concerned with consistency. We could talk about disease resistance, about how populations exposed to malaria evolved sickle cell trait, which protects against malaria but causes anemia when inherited from both parents. About how populations in West Africa developed resistance to sleeping sickness, about how Europeans developed resistance to bubonic plague, about how every population carries in its genome the scars of every epidemic its ancestors survived. We could talk about ears, about the tiny muscles in the outer ear that most humans can't use anymore, but that some populations retained longer, because hearing slight differences in sound frequency mattered more in dense forests than open savannas. About how human variation is so granular, so specific, so relentlessly local, that almost every feature you can see has a story behind it. But we don't have that kind of time. Not tonight. Because the real point, the one that keeps getting lost in conversations about human diversity, is that none of these differences are boundaries. They're not borders. They're not categories. They're gradients, continuous, overlapping, messy gradients. The same way a rainbow doesn't have a line where red becomes orange. It just shifts, slowly, unnoticeably, until you look at one end and then the other and realize you've traveled further than you thought. Human populations are rainbows. They always have been. The reason you can't draw a clean line between racial groups isn't political correctness, it's biology. The genetic variation doesn't cluster neatly into racial categories. It clumps, then spreads, then clumps differently. The genes that determine skin color are not the same genes that determine nose shape, which are not the same genes that determine lactose tolerance, which are not the same genes that determine altitude adaptation. They move independently, they mix, they recombine. Every generation is a new experiment. This is why, when geneticists look at human variation, they don't see races, they see clines, gradients of genetic frequency that shift across geography. A cline for skin color, a cline for nose shape, a cline for body proportions, all of them moving at different rates, in different directions, responding to different pressures. The human species is not a set of boxes, it's a cloud, and like any cloud, it changes shape depending on where you stand. So why do we see races? Why does almost every human culture, throughout history, divide people into categories based on how they look? That's not a biology question anymore. That's a psychology question, and the answer is both simpler and more disturbing than you might expect. The human brain is a pattern-matching machine. It evolved to make snap judgments. to decide in milliseconds whether that shape in the tall grass is a lion or just a shadow. That speed saved lives. But it came with a cost. The cost is that the brain prefers categories over continua. It likes boxes. It likes to say, this is like that, and that is different from this. It does this automatically, unconsciously, constantly. Even when the categories it creates are wrong, especially when the categories it creates are wrong, your brain sees someone with different skin color and automatically categorizes them as different, not because different is bad, just because different is noticeable. And noticeable things, evolutionarily speaking, are worth paying attention to. That person might be from another tribe. They might have different resources. They might be a threat. They might be an opportunity. But they are not default. They are not background. They are worth noting. That's the seed. Everything else, racism, xenophobia, discrimination, all of it, grows from that tiny, automatic, evolutionarily useful seed. A seed that evolved in a world where different usually meant dangerous, where encountering someone from outside your group genuinely was risky, where strangers might not share your immunity to local diseases, might not know your customs, might accidentally offend you in ways that led to violence. That world doesn't exist anymore. Humans live in cities of millions. We encounter strangers constantly. We trade with people on the other side of the planet. We share culture, language, and memes across continents. The ancient brain, with its ancient biases, is running software that was written for a completely different hardware environment. It keeps categorizing, keeps noticing differences, keeps building boxes. And then history happens. Once you have categories, you need stories about why the categories exist. Those stories become myths. Myths become justifications for power. Power becomes hierarchy. Hierarchy becomes oppression. Oppression becomes trauma. Trauma becomes memory. Memory becomes identity. Identity becomes politics. And 400 years later, you're still arguing about the same categories that some exhausted hominid invented because their brain was trying to save them from a lion. This is not an excuse. Understanding why something happens is not the same as forgiving it, but understanding is the first step toward something else, toward seeing the machine for what it is, toward recognizing that the categories are not real, even though the consequences of believing in them are devastatingly real, toward looking at another person and seeing not a race, not a category, not a box, but a fellow wanderer. Someone whose ancestors, like yours, walked out of Africa. Someone whose skin color is a conversation between latitude, migration history, and dinner. Someone whose face shape is a frozen argument about breathing cold air. Someone whose very existence is a miracle of unbroken survival, generation after generation, through ice ages and famines and plagues and wars. Someone who is, genetically, almost identical to you. The differences are real. Skin color is real. Face shapes are real. Body proportions are real. But they are superficial. They are recent. They are adaptations to local conditions that will change again as conditions change, which they will. Because humans are still migrating, still mixing, still making new combinations that have never existed before. The future of human skin color is more diversity, not less. More mixing, more gradients, more rainbows. The categories that seemed so solid to previous generations are dissolving in real time. And good riddance. They were never solid to begin with. They were just stories. Stories we told ourselves, because our brains like boxes and our ancestors liked to know who was in their tribe. But the tribe is everyone now. Or it could be. That's the quiet hope buried under all this history. The hope that understanding why we became different colors might help us stop caring so much about the differences, might help us see the shared humanity underneath, might help us wander a little further, together, into whatever comes next. Before we go, I want to leave you with one more image, something to hold on to the next time someone tries to tell you that skin color means more than it does. Imagine a map of the world, not the political map with its borders and capitals. A different map. A map where every human population is colored not by their skin, but by the path their ancestors walked to get where they are. Every line converging on East Africa, Every arrow pointing back to the same small group of people who survived something terrible 70,000 years ago and then started walking. Some went north into the cold, some went east across the water, some stayed. But all of them came from the same place. All of them share the same ancestors. All of them are family. That map is real. That map is genetics. That map is history. Skin color is just what happens when your family moves to a different neighborhood, a new climate, a new diet, a new sun. It's not a new species. It's not a new category. It's just a new jacket. And jackets, as we all know, can be changed. They should be changed. They will be changed. Because humans, as we've established, have never been good at staying in one place. The sun is setting now, somewhere. Maybe where you are, maybe not. The colors in the sky are orange and pink and purple and gold. None of those colors are real. They're just light bending through atmosphere, just photons scattering off molecules, just physics doing what physics does. But they're beautiful anyway. They're beautiful because they're temporary, because they're changing, because they remind us that the world is not static, that everything shifts, that the only constant is movement. Your skin is like that sunset. It's a moment, a snapshot, a temporary arrangement of molecules that will be different in your grandchildren, different in ways you can't predict, different in ways that might surprise you, that might delight you, that might, if you're lucky, make you forget why you ever cared about the old categories in the first place. The ancestors who walked out of Africa didn't know where they were going. They didn't know they were changing the color of their descendants. They didn't know they were starting conversations that would last 100,000 years. They were just hungry, just restless, just human. And we are still them, still wandering, still changing, still having the same conversation the sun started 100,000 years ago. The conversation about how to survive, about how to adapt, about how to look at the person next to you and see not a stranger, but another version of yourself, another branch on the same ancient tree, another color in the same endless sunset. The sun will rise tomorrow. It always does. It always has. And humans will keep waking up, keep moving, keep mixing, keep becoming whatever comes next. Whatever color that is, it will be beautiful. It will be temporary. It will be human. And that, I think, is worth staying up late to think about.